It was the kind of bitterly cold night where the wind seemed to cut through even the thickest of jackets. But it wasn't the weather that stopped Jason in his tracks. It was the sight of a toddler, no more than 3, huddled on the sidewalk, alone and shivering. His breath caught in his throat as he noticed a note pinned to the child's jacket. "We can't take care of him anymore." Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Jason pulled his hood tighter against the wind, bracing himself for the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. Winter nights in the neighborhood were always harsh, but this evening felt particularly unforgiving. He trudged along the snow-covered sidewalk, the streetlights casting long shadows across the icy ground. His breath came out in heavy puffs, visible in the frigid air, as he moved past houses whose windows were shut tight against the cold. As a black teenager in his final year of high school, Jason had learned to navigate the world with a sense of caution. His life was a constant balancing act between trying to prove himself and avoiding situations that might label him as trouble. Tonight, however, his thoughts were elsewhere, on his future, his family, and the weight of responsibility he felt pressing down on him. His mother, Karen, worked tirelessly to support him and his younger sister, Talia, and Jason knew that the expectations placed on him were heavy. Graduation was just around the corner, and while Jason had dreams of attending college and making something of himself, the path ahead felt uncertain. College was expensive, and even with his good grades, scholarships weren't guaranteed. The thought of staying in the neighborhood, where opportunities were scarce, terrified him. The pressure to succeed, not just for himself but for his family, gnawed at him daily. As Jason neared the corner of the street, something unusual caught his eye. A small figure, barely visible in the dim light, sat hunched on the curb. At first, he thought it was a bundle of blankets or perhaps discarded trash, but as he drew closer, he realized it was something far more concerning. A child, no older than 3 or 4, was sitting alone, their tiny body shivering in the cold. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around, hoping to see an adult nearby, but the street was empty. His breath quickened as he approached the child cautiously. The little one was wrapped in a thin, inadequate blanket, their cheeks flushed red from the biting cold. Tears streaked their pale face, and their eyes were wide with fear and confusion. Jason knelt down, his mind racing. "Hey, little one," he said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the anxiety rising in his chest. "What are you doing out here? Where's your mom or dad?" The child didn't respond, just sniffled and looked up at Jason with wide, tear-filled eyes. It was clear the toddler was too young to understand much of what was happening. Jason's heart clenched. He knew he couldn't leave the child here, abandoned in the freezing cold. But what could he do? Taking the child himself could lead to a whole host of problems. He knew how people might perceive him, a young black man holding a white toddler. It didn't matter what his intentions were. The world didn't always see intentions. It saw appearances. His pulse quickened as the weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about helping a lost child. This was about what people would think if they saw him with that child. And the consequences of those thoughts could be devastating. Jason had seen it happen before. He had seen how quickly people's assumptions could spiral out of control. But looking down at the shivering toddler, Jason knew he didn't have a choice. This kid needed help, and fast. "Okay," he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. "I can't leave you out here." He picked the child up gently, the little one immediately clinging to him for warmth. Jason could feel the cold radiating from the toddler's small body. His mind raced, trying to figure out his next move. There was no way he could leave the child on the street, but he also knew he couldn't just walk around with a white toddler without attracting unwanted attention. His first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped him. Jason knew all too well how interactions with law enforcement could go wrong for someone who looked like him. There was always the chance that someone might think the worst, that he had done something to the child. He couldn't risk that, not without more information. Jason shifted the child in his arms, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "We'll figure this out," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure how. He glanced around, trying to think of where he could go. The nearest open place was a small convenience store down the block. Maybe he could warm the child up there while he figured out what to do next. The store wasn't far, but the cold was relentless, and Jason knew the child couldn't stay outside much longer. With determined steps, he began walking toward the store, cradling the toddler in his arms. Each step felt heavier than the last as the reality of the situation set in. Why was this child out here alone? Jason's mind whirred with questions. Who had left them? Where was their family? And why had no one else noticed? As they reached the store, Jason felt a surge of relief. The warmth inside would be a temporary reprieve from the bitter cold outside. He pushed the door open, and the warmth hit him immediately, a welcome contrast to the freezing wind. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly as he stepped inside, the familiar buzz of the store's heater filling the silence. The cashier, an older man who had seen Jason around before, gave him a curious look, but didn't say anything. Jason nodded in acknowledgement, heading to the back of the store where the heater was blasting near the shelves of canned goods. The child's shivering lessened as they warmed up, but their eyes remained wide and scared. Jason crouched down next to the toddler, brushing a strand of hair from their tear-streaked face. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, though the uncertainty in his own voice was hard to ignore. "We're going to figure this out." As the child clung to him, Jason noticed something else, something that made his stomach drop. There was a small piece of paper pinned to the child's jacket. His hands shook slightly as he reached for it, pulling the note free and unfolding it carefully. The words were hastily scrawled, barely legible. "We can't take care of him anymore. Please help." Jason stared at the note, his heart pounding in his chest. Abandoned? The child, this small, innocent toddler, had been left alone in the freezing cold with nothing but a note. Anger and confusion swirled inside Jason, but more than that, a deep sense of responsibility settled over him. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a child who had been deliberately abandoned. And now, it seemed, it was up to Jason to figure out what to do next. He tucked the note into his pocket, his mind racing. His next steps were unclear. But one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not ever. Jason sighed, standing up and looking at the child who was now sitting a little calmer by the heater. "Okay, little one," he whispered. "I've got you. I'll help." But deep down he knew that helping wouldn't be easy. The warmth of the convenience store offered a momentary comfort, but Jason couldn't shake the anxiety building inside him. The child, Ethan, as he would later learn, had stopped crying, settling into a tired, dazed quiet. Jason looked around nervously, his eyes darting from the child to the cashier, who was now busy stocking shelves, and back to the note crumpled in his pocket. "We can't take care of him anymore. Please help." Those words gnawed at him. There was something profoundly unsettling about seeing them attached to a child left to the mercy of the cold night. Jason could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. Who could just abandon their kid like this? And why? The questions whirled through his head, but there were no easy answers. What he did know was that this situation had become far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Jason crouched down again beside the heater, looking into the toddler's face. Ethan had stopped shivering, his cheeks now flushed from the warmth of the heater. The little boy stared back at him with wide, innocent eyes, his lips trembling slightly. Jason felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility wash over him. He couldn't just walk away from this. But how was he supposed to handle something like this without making things worse for himself? Taking a deep breath, Jason fumbled for his phone and dialed the only person he could think of, his mom. His mother, Karen, had always been the rock of their small family. Raising Jason and his sister, Talia, on her own had been no easy feat, especially in a world where people often judged her for the color of her skin. She was tough, though, and Jason had inherited that same strength from her. She had taught him right from wrong, instilled in him the value of doing good even when no one was watching. But as he waited for her to pick up, Jason couldn't help but wonder if this situation was too much, even for them. "Jason?" His mother's voice came through the phone, concerned. "You okay, baby? It's late." "Mom," Jason started, trying to keep his voice steady, though his nerves were clear. I found this kid, a little boy. He was just sitting out on the curb in the cold. There's this note that says his parents can't take care of him anymore. There was silence on the other end of the line, but Jason could hear the worry building in his mother's breath. "Jason, where are you right now?" Karen asked, her voice controlled but edged with concern. "I'm at the corner store. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave him there. He's freezing, Mom. What am I supposed to do?" Jason's voice wavered, and it felt strange to hear himself sound so unsure. He was used to being calm, keeping his emotions in check, but this situation had him rattled. Karen was quiet for a moment, likely processing everything Jason had said. When she spoke again, her voice was resolute. "You did the right thing bringing him inside," she said. "But you know we have to be careful, Jason. You know how people can be. You showing up with this little white child, people might not see it the way it really is." Jason winced. He had already thought of that, of how the world could twist his good intentions into something ugly. His mother didn't need to remind him of the stakes. They were all too real. "I know, Mom. I was worried about that too," he admitted. "But I couldn't just leave him out there. What should I do now?" There was a long pause. Jason could hear the faint sound of the TV in the background at home, the voices from some late-night program mingling with the tense silence on the phone. "Bring him here," Karen finally said, her voice firm. "We'll figure it out. But Jason, listen to me. Be careful. If anyone sees you walking with that child, they might get the wrong idea." Jason felt the knot in his chest tighten. He hated that his mother had to give him that warning. He hated that in situations like this, race could make the difference between being seen as a hero or being seen as a threat. But he understood why she said it. Jason knew that he couldn't afford to make any mistakes tonight. "Okay, I'll be careful. I'll see you soon," Jason said, hanging up the phone. He turned back to Ethan, who was now looking up at him with sleepy eyes, his small hands clutching the fabric of Jason's jacket. The innocence in the child's gaze was heartbreaking. Ethan didn't understand any of this. The cold, the note, the way the world worked. He just needed someone to care. With a deep breath, Jason stood up and lifted the toddler into his arms once again, making sure to wrap him securely in the blanket. As he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a wall, the wind stinging his face. But he kept moving, determined to get home as quickly as possible. The walk back to his house felt like an eternity, every step filled with unease. Jason moved through the empty streets as quietly as he could, his senses heightened, alert to any movement or sound around him. His breath formed clouds in the air, and his heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. As he turned the corner onto his street, his heart skipped a beat when he saw a car pass by slowly. He instinctively held Ethan closer, his body tensing. The car didn't stop, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He knew that people could make assumptions, and all it would take was one wrong assumption to turn his night upside down. Finally, Jason reached the front door of his home, his relief palpable as he stepped inside. The warmth of the house enveloped him, but the tension didn't leave his body. His mother was waiting in the living room, her face a mix of concern and understanding. Karen stood up as Jason entered, her eyes softening when she saw the little boy in his arms. She walked over and gently touched Ethan's cheek, her expression filled with sadness. "This poor child," she whispered. "What kind of situation must his family be in to leave him like this?" Jason set Ethan down on the couch, carefully removing the blanket. The child blinked up at them sleepily, his small body curling into the cushions. Karen looked at Jason, her eyes filled with both pride and worry. "You did the right thing, Jason," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "But we're going to have to be smart about this." Jason nodded, though the unease in his chest hadn't fully lifted. "What do we do now?" he asked. Karen sat down beside Ethan, brushing a strand of hair from the toddler's forehead. "We'll take care of him tonight, make sure he's safe. But tomorrow, we'll need to call someone. We can't keep him, Jason. As much as I wish we could help, this is bigger than us." Jason knew she was right, but the thought of handing Ethan over to strangers in the morning left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had made a connection with this child, however brief, and the idea of letting him go was harder than he expected. For now, though, all he could do was wait. Wait for the morning, wait for answers, wait to see what would happen next. Jason sat on the edge of the couch, his fingers nervously tapping against his knees as he watched Ethan sleep. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the heater working overtime to ward off the chill. His mother, Karen, had retreated to the kitchen to make tea, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts and the weight of the decision they were all trying to navigate. Ethan's small form was curled into the corner of the couch, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The blanket Karen had draped over him looked almost comically large compared to his small frame. For a moment, Jason allowed himself to feel a sliver of calm. The child was safe, warm, and no longer out in the freezing cold. But that calm was fleeting. Jason leaned back, his thoughts once again consumed by the implications of what had happened tonight. He had always been careful to avoid situations that might put him at odds with the world. He had seen firsthand how easily things could go wrong for someone like him. Growing up, he had heard the stories about boys his age and even younger, who had been misunderstood, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who had simply existed in a world that judged them before knowing them. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan sitting alone on that curb, the cold biting at his skin, completely defenseless, and he couldn't ignore the anger bubbling up inside him, directed at whoever had left the boy there. What kind of life must they have been living to feel like this was their only option? The note had said, "We can't take care of him anymore." What did that even mean? The door to Talia's room creaked open, and Jason's 12-year-old sister poked her head out, blinking sleepily at the scene unfolding in the living room. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "Who's that?" Jason motioned for her to come over. "It's a long story," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Ethan. Talia walked over, her curiosity piqued as she sat down next to Jason on the couch. She peered over at Ethan, her brows furrowing in concern. "Why is there a baby on our couch?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Where did he come from?" Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure how to explain everything to Talia, especially since he was still trying to make sense of it himself. But Talia was smart. She had always been wise beyond her years, a product of growing up in a world that demanded too much too soon. "I found him outside," Jason said finally. "He was just sitting on the curb, all by himself. His parents, they left a note saying they couldn't take care of him." Talia's eyes widened, and her gaze shifted back to Ethan, who stirred slightly in his sleep but didn't wake. "That's so sad," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine empathy. "Why would someone do that?" Jason shook his head, the answer still eluding him. "I don't know, but we're going to figure it out. Mom's trying to decide what we should do next." Talia leaned in closer to Ethan, her expression softening. "He's cute," she said, reaching out carefully to brush a strand of hair from the toddler's forehead. "He looks like he's been through a lot." Jason nodded, feeling a surge of protective instinct rise within him. In the short time that Ethan had been in their home, Jason had already started to feel responsible for him, as though it was his duty to make sure the little boy was safe. He didn't know how long Ethan had been out there, but the thought of the child enduring even a moment of that cold made Jason's heart ache. Before either of them could say anything else, Karen walked back into the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Jason and then sat down across from them, her eyes falling on Ethan as she let out a heavy sigh. "He's sleeping now," she said softly, as though trying to avoid breaking the peace that had settled over the room. Jason took a sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through him, though it did little to alleviate the unease that still gnawed at him. "What are we going to do, Mom?" he asked quietly, glancing at his mother over the rim of his mug. Karen sighed again, setting her mug down on the coffee table. She looked tired, more than tired, really. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from years of fighting against the tide, from carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jason could see it in the lines around her eyes, in the way she sat, shoulders hunched as though the very act of sitting upright was too much. "We can't keep him here forever," Karen said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "As much as I want to help, This is too big for us to handle on our own. Jason knew she was right, but the idea of turning Ethan over to the authorities, of sending him back into a system that might not care for him the way they had in just a few hours, made Jason's stomach turn. What if he got lost in the system? What if he ended up with people who didn't care about him? The thought was unbearable. Talia looked between her mother and brother, sensing the tension in the room. "Can't we just keep him for a little while?" she asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. "Just until we figure something out?" Karen gave Talia a small, sad smile. "I wish it were that simple, baby," she said, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "But we don't know anything about his situation. The people who left him might be in trouble themselves. They might come looking for him. And we don't want to get caught up in something that could put us in danger." Jason's chest tightened at his mother's words. He hated the idea that helping someone could somehow put them at risk. But the reality of their world was that things weren't always fair. Sometimes, doing the right thing came with consequences that were hard to predict. "Maybe we could call someone tomorrow," Jason suggested, though he didn't feel good about it, "like child services or the police. Maybe they can help." Karen nodded slowly, though it was clear the decision didn't sit well with her either. "We'll have to, but for tonight, we'll keep him safe. That's all we can do for now." Talia leaned back against the couch, her gaze still fixed on Ethan. "I don't want him to go," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "He seems really sweet and scared." Jason felt the same way. But deep down, he knew that keeping Ethan wasn't an option. Their home was small, their resources stretched thin. As much as they wanted to help, they weren't equipped to take on something like this. It was a harsh reality, but one they had to face. Karen stood up, stretching her arms above her head. "I'll set up a spot for him to sleep in Talia's room tonight," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "We'll deal with everything else in the morning." Jason nodded, feeling a knot of dread forming in his stomach. He knew tomorrow would bring difficult decisions, and he wasn't sure if any of them would feel like the right one. As Karen and Talia worked to make a temporary bed for Ethan, Jason sat on the couch, staring into the now empty mug of tea in his hands. His mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next, of what this little boy's future might hold. He thought about the note again. "We can't take care of him anymore." What kind of circumstances could lead someone to make such a heartbreaking choice? What kind of world did Ethan come from, and what kind of world was he about to be thrown into? Jason had no answers, only questions. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened next, Ethan's life had already been changed forever. And so had Jason's. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Jason's small bedroom, casting a dull light over the room. He hadn't slept much, his mind too occupied with what the day would bring. The weight of responsibility still pressed on him as heavily as the moment he had found Ethan shivering on the street. Everything felt surreal, like he was caught in a situation that didn't belong to him, but somehow it had become his burden to bear. He had heard his mother and Talia quietly tending to Ethan throughout the night. The boy had woken a few times, disoriented and crying, but Karen had managed to soothe him back to sleep each time. The fact that Ethan's parents, or whoever had left him, hadn't come looking for him only deepened the mystery. Jason sat up in bed, rubbing his face as he tried to shake off the remnants of sleep. Today, they would have to make a decision. As much as Jason had grown attached to the little boy in such a short time, he knew they couldn't keep him indefinitely. But the thought of handing Ethan over to child services, or worse, the police, filled him with unease. His mother had warned him about how careful they needed to be, and that warning echoed in his mind. After throwing on some clothes, Jason headed to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee greeted him. His mother was at the stove, pouring herself a cup while the radio played softly in the background. Talia was still in her room, likely trying to keep Ethan entertained. The tension in the house was palpable, like a string pulled tight and ready to snap. "You sleep at all?" Karen asked without turning around, sensing Jason's presence. "Not much," he admitted, leaning against the counter. His voice was thick with exhaustion. "Kept thinking about what we're going to do today." Karen sighed, setting the coffee pot down and turning to face him. Her eyes were tired, the dark circles beneath them telling of her own sleepless night. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. "We can't keep him here, Jason. As much as I want to protect that little boy, we can't put ourselves in a situation where people start asking questions." Jason knew she was right, but that didn't make the decision any easier. He had grown up watching his mother make tough choices, sacrifices for the sake of their family, and now he was being asked to do the same. But this was different. This was a helpless child who had been left in the cold with nothing but a note that gave no real answers, only more questions. "I know," Jason muttered, "but I keep thinking, what if the system just loses him? What if he ends up in a worse situation than the one he came from?" Karen nodded, her expression softening as she stepped closer to Jason. "I've thought about that too, believe me. But if we don't let someone know about him, what kind of future will he have here? We don't have the resources to take care of him, and you know how people look at us. We can't risk them thinking we did something wrong." Jason clenched his fists, frustrated by the truth of her words. It wasn't fair, but life had taught them both that fairness wasn't guaranteed, especially not for people like them. They had to tread carefully in situations like this because all it would take was one wrong assumption, one person seeing something out of context, and their entire lives could be turned upside down. Suddenly, a knock at the door echoed through the small house. Jason's heart leaped into his throat as he exchanged a glance with his mother. The knocking was followed by a voice calling out, "Hello, is anyone home? Police department?" Jason felt his chest tighten as his mother's eyes widened. The police? He hadn't expected them so soon. He hadn't expected them at all. Who had called them? Had someone seen him with Ethan the night before and jumped to the worst conclusion? The very thing he had feared was now standing on their doorstep. Karen set her coffee down, her hand trembling slightly as she wiped her palms on her apron. "Stay calm," she whispered, though Jason could hear the fear creeping into her voice. "We have nothing to hide. Just tell the truth." Jason nodded, his heart pounding as he moved to the door, trying to steel himself for what was about to happen. He opened it cautiously, and there stood two uniformed officers, their faces unreadable. One was a man in his 40s, his expression hardened by years on the job, and the other was a younger woman, her gaze softer but still professional. The sight of them sent a shiver down Jason's spine. "Good morning," the male officer began, his voice neutral but firm. "We received a report about a missing child in the area, and we're just going around to make sure everything is okay. Have you seen anything unusual? Any sign of a lost child?" Jason swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. His instinct was to deny it, to shut the door and act like he knew nothing. But that wasn't the truth, and he knew lying could only make things worse. He took a deep breath, glancing over his shoulder at his mother, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Yes," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. "I found a child last night. He was sitting outside, all alone in the cold. I brought him inside to keep him safe." The officers exchanged a quick glance, and the woman stepped forward slightly. "Can we come in and speak with you about it?" Jason hesitated, glancing back at his mother once more. Karen wiped her hands on her apron again before stepping forward and opening the door wider. "Of course," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Please, come in." The officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the small living room, taking in the surroundings. Jason's stomach churned as he tried to gauge their reactions. He knew how easily things could go wrong in situations like this, how quickly assumptions could be made. But they had done nothing wrong. Ethan had been abandoned, and they had simply taken him in to keep him safe. That was the truth. Karen led the officers to the couch, offering them a seat, though they politely declined. The male officer glanced around, his gaze landing on Talia, who was now standing in the doorway of her room, holding Ethan's tiny hand. "There he is," the officer said softly, nodding toward the toddler. "Is that the child you found?" Jason nodded, his throat tightening as Ethan looked up at him, his wide eyes filled with confusion. The little boy was clutching Talia's hand tightly, clearly afraid of the unfamiliar faces in the room. Jason could see the fear in Ethan's expression, and it broke his heart. "He was sitting outside last night, all alone," Jason explained, trying to keep his voice even. He had this note pinned to his jacket. It said his parents couldn't take care of him anymore. The female officer's expression softened as she knelt down to Ethan's level, offering him a kind smile. "Hey there, little guy," she said gently. "You okay?" Ethan didn't respond, just clung to Talia, his small fingers gripping her sleeve as if she were the only thing keeping him safe. Jason's heart ached at the sight. In such a short time, the boy had bonded with them, found some semblance of comfort in their presence. And now, it was all about to be torn away. The officers turned back to Jason and Karen, their expressions more sympathetic now. The tension in the room shifted, though it didn't completely dissipate. "We appreciate what you've done for him," the male officer said, his tone gentler now. "But we'll need to take him with us. We have to make sure he's placed somewhere safe, and we'll need to investigate what happened with his parents." Jason's chest tightened at the thought of handing Ethan over. Somewhere safe? That was the same system that too often let kids like Ethan slip through the cracks. What if they couldn't protect him? What if Ethan ended up in a situation just as bad or worse than the one he had come from? But what choice did they have? Karen placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, sensing his hesitation. "We'll do what's best for him," she whispered, though Jason could hear the sadness in her voice. "It's not up to us now." Jason swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. He knew his mother was right. As much as it hurt, they couldn't keep Ethan. They couldn't give him the life he deserved. And while the system wasn't perfect, it was better than the alternative. With a heavy heart, Jason knelt down and gently lifted Ethan into his arms one last time. The boy whimpered softly, his small fingers gripping Jason's shirt as though he knew what was about to happen. Jason hugged him tightly, his chest aching as Ethan's soft breath tickled his neck. "It's going to be okay," Jason whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Ethan or himself. The officer stepped forward, and with a final, tearful glance, Jason handed Ethan over. The little boy looked back at him, confused and scared, as the officers led him out the door. Jason stood frozen in place, the weight of the moment crashing down on him like a tidal wave. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. The house felt impossibly quiet after the officers left with Ethan. The absence of the toddler's presence left a tangible emptiness in the room, like the air itself had been sucked out, leaving Jason feeling hollow. He stood by the door for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where Ethan had clung to him, his small, trembling hands grasping onto Jason as if he were the last safe thing in the world. Karen was the first to break the silence, her voice gentle but firm as she turned away from the now closed door. "We did the right thing," she said, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than anyone else. "He's with the authorities now. They'll take care of him." Jason didn't respond, his mind replaying the events of the morning over and over. The look on Ethan's face, the way his small body had shuddered in his arms, as if he already knew this goodbye was permanent. Jason had tried to stay strong, but that look had shattered something inside him. It was the same kind of helplessness he'd felt so many times before, growing up in a world where so much of his life was beyond his control. Talia had disappeared into her room without a word, likely retreating to cope in her own way. She had bonded with Ethan too, and Jason knew this wasn't easy for her. His little sister, usually so full of energy and optimism, had been uncharacteristically quiet all morning. Jason could hear the faint sound of her humming softly to herself, a tune she often used to calm her nerves. He wanted to go to her, comfort her, but he wasn't sure he had the strength to deal with his own emotions, let alone hers. Karen busied herself in the kitchen, her way of coping with the turmoil that had descended on their home. Jason could hear the clattering of pots and pans, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, as if the mundane tasks might somehow restore a sense of normalcy to their lives. But Jason knew better. Things weren't going to feel normal for a long time, if ever. Jason wandered to the couch, sinking into the worn cushions. His mind was still racing, filled with thoughts of what might happen to Ethan now. Would the boy even remember him in a few years? Would he be safe, happy? Or would he be another name lost in the system? Shuffled from home to home with no real sense of belonging? The idea gnawed at him, filling him with a frustration he couldn't quite articulate. As the hours passed, Jason tried to distract himself, but nothing could fully pull him away from the weight of what had happened. The house remained quiet, almost eerily so, until the sound of the doorbell broke through the stillness, jolting Jason from his thoughts. He exchanged a confused glance with Karen, who had paused mid-task in the kitchen. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Jason shook his head, his heart skipping a beat. They had just dealt with the police earlier that day. What could this be about now? Karen motioned for him to stay put as she walked toward the door, her face tense with worry. When Karen opened the door, she was greeted by an unfamiliar face, a woman in her late 20s, dressed in a simple but neat coat, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired but determined, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a heavy burden for far too long. In her hands was a letter, and though her face was unfamiliar, there was something about her presence that immediately set Jason on edge. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice shaky but polite. "My name is Clara, and I'm looking for Jason." Jason stood up slowly, his confusion deepening as he moved closer to the door. His mother stepped aside, her brow furrowed as Jason came into view. "That's me," he said cautiously. "Can I help you?" Clara swallowed hard, her eyes flickering with emotion as she held out the letter. "I'm not sure how to explain this," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "But this is from Ethan's biological parents. They asked me to give it to you." Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he took the letter from her hands. The paper was crumpled and worn, as though it had been carried around for days, weeks, or even months before it had found its way to him. He looked down at the envelope, his name hastily scribbled on the front, and for a moment he was too stunned to speak. Karen stepped closer, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How do you know about Ethan?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "How did you find us?" Clara let out a deep breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's complicated," she admitted. "But Ethan's parents, they've been going through something unimaginable. I've been helping them as much as I can, but they're in a really bad situation. When they heard what happened, that you took Ethan in and cared for him, they wanted you to know how grateful they are." Jason's mind was spinning. Ethan's parents knew what had happened? They knew Jason had taken him in? He looked down at the letter again, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was written in the same rushed handwriting as the note he had found on Ethan's jacket that night. "Dear Jason, we're sorry. We never wanted it to come to this. We love Ethan more than anything in this world, but our lives are falling apart and we had no other choice. We were scared, desperate. When we left him, we thought it was the only way to keep him safe. But hearing that you took him in, that you protected him when we couldn't, gave us hope in a way we didn't think was possible. We don't know what's going to happen to us or to Ethan, but we wanted to thank you. Thank you for being the kind of person who didn't just walk by. You gave us a chance to believe that there are still good people in the world. We hope, someday, to explain this to Ethan, but for now, all we can do is say thank you. You gave him warmth when we couldn't, and we'll never forget that." With gratitude, his parents Jason stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity, the words blurring together as the weight of their meanings sank in. His heart ached for Ethan's parents, people he had never met, but whose pain and fear were now palpable through their desperate words. They were in trouble?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked up at Clara. "Why didn't they just ask for help?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly. "Sometimes when people are scared, they make bad decisions," she said softly. "Ethan's parents didn't know where to turn, and in their fear, they made a choice that they'll regret for the rest of their lives. But you gave them hope. And for that, they wanted you to know that you'll always be a part of Ethan's story." Jason's chest tightened as Clara's words sank in. He had done the right thing that night, despite his fears, despite the risks. He had acted out of kindness, and in doing so, he had changed the course of Ethan's life, and perhaps his own. Clara gave him a sad smile, stepping back from the door. "I'll let you go," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I just wanted to make sure you got that letter. Jason nodded, still too overwhelmed to say much of anything, as Clara turned and walked away. He watched her go, the letter still clutched tightly in his hands, before closing the door behind him. The silence in the house had returned, but it no longer felt as suffocating as before. Karen placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft and full of pride. "You did good, Jason," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You did something that mattered." Jason nodded, unable to speak as he looked down at the letter again. In the end, Ethan had been taken from their care, but the boy's story hadn't ended there. There was hope. There was a chance for healing, for both Ethan and his parents. And maybe, just maybe, Jason had found a way to heal too. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.